The VICA is very pleased to sponsor this program, and we want to thank the Jewish congregation of Venice for making this place available to us, the temple, and we're very, very happy that you all could come tonight. I should remind you that this is the first of 3 sessions. The next 2 Mondays will follow on to this, and Donna will tell you more about that. So I just want to thank you all for being here. Logistically, what we hope to do is after the talk is done, or at least completed to the point where we want to start more discussion, you will have questions at the table, and we hope you'll discuss at your table some of the key issues. And then we'll have you reply, and we'll try and answer some of those questions. I won't try to answer them, but the experts will. So, without further ado, let our speaker take over.
Can I?
Yes.
1 moment.
Go on.
Good evening. My name is Eli Rappaport, and I'm president of the Jewish congregation of Venice. Hold your applause for the main speaker, not for me. I just want you to notice there are 2 emergency exits, one over there, one over here. So in case of an emergency, if the ceiling starts falling in, don't go out the way you came in. Go to the nearest exit, which is right there and right there. Thank you very much. Enjoy the program.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you so much. Now, can you hear me as well? Eli, they can't hear me. Well, good evening. Is that better?
Yeah.
Good. I am Donna Batchelor, and I am the first presenter of this year's FICA Winter Series, and I am truly honored to be here tonight. And I know that all of you join me in thanking the Jewish congregation of Venice for their gracious hospitality and warm welcome. You have made us feel like family, which is fitting in nicely with our theme. We are family. We share a common ancestor, Abraham, the great patriarch of the Hebrew Bible, the spiritual forefather of the New Testament, and the grand holy architect of the Quran, our father, Abraham. In some cases, the biological father of over 12 million Jews, over 2 billion Christians, and 1.5 million Muslims. That's 1/2 of the humans that are alive on this planet now, who claim Abraham as their father. Father Abraham. So what do you know about him? Well, tonight I will explore with you some of the sacred scriptures that tell his story, that becomes our story, our family story. Now, we're at tables intentionally because that is our metaphor, the family table, which I'm sure for many of you has been the site of some of the biggest fights in your family that you can remember. And surely some of the warmest and most memorable times of sharing with family. So tonight we will use these texts for our examination of Abraham and his family. We'll look at the scriptural beginning of the story that begins with the words, lech lecha, go, and keeps on going for centuries, for millennia. It's an old story. You've probably heard it before at Sunday school, Hebrew school, at the mosque. But this story doesn't just impact the places where we worship. This story is part of our secular, everyday world. And it can still be heard in our halls of justice and injustice, in our hospitals and schools, and not just seminaries and yeshivas or madrasas. This story can be heard in grammar schools and colleges and universities, in cities like Tallahassee, Washington, D.C., places of power. So I ask you tonight, listen for the power in this story. Who has it? Who wants it? Who deserves it? Now, I believe that we're still asking these questions, and we're still trying to answer them. And we'll give it a go tonight, and again next Monday and the Monday after that. We'll talk about power. But now let's look at the story. The story of Abraham and his family first appear in the first book of this book. The work is well known and foundational for both Jews and Christians. The first is called the Bible. You've probably heard of it. And the first book of the Bible is called Genesis. And we'll look at chapters 12 to 25 of Genesis. But this book of which Genesis is a part has a lot of other names. It's also called the Tanakh, or the Bible by Jews, and sometimes it's called the Old Testament, mostly by Christians. But it's also called the Hebrew Bible and the First Testament. Well, the story that we hear tonight in this book reappears in this book, which is called the New Testament. It's the second part of the first book we mentioned before, the Hebrew Bible. But Christians don't call it the Christian Bible. They call it the New Testament, or the Second Testament. Now, still later in time, the story reappears in this book, which is unique to Muslims. And it's not referred to by any other name except the Quran, thank goodness, right? Well, in many ways, the two reappearances of the story depend on and depart from the first book of the First Testament. And we'll see that tonight. Now, tonight we will not be doing any comprehensive review of the text. I will fly through the text like Muhammad on his night journey. And I am aware that there are inherent dangers when discussing sacred religious literature. And since I will be discussing 3 sacred texts, it's safe to assume that it will be 3 times more dangerous than usual. But I'm ready. I have girded my loins. And I see some of you men out there laughing. What? Because you think ladies don't have loins, right? But we do. And we've been girding them forever, right, ladies? And we all sit in judgment of these texts. We even sit in judgment of God. And Genesis 12 to 25 makes it easy to do that. These stories are messy, and the mess could have been cleaned up before the stories became canonical, but they weren't cleaned up. They're still messy. So let's not be afraid to get dirty tonight. And I bet you didn't expect to hear that, right? Get down and dirty tonight. But seriously, don't worry about anything tonight, because God has a great sense of humor. Now, after we fly through Genesis 12 to 25, we'll look at this section of the Bible, the New Testament, or the Second Testament, and we'll see how Genesis is used by Paul. Paul is the epistle-writing exegete of the first century, and he writes not long after Jesus dies, and he can be very complicated, you'll see. 600 years after Paul writes, another story of Abraham is revealed by Allah to Muhammad, who recites the revelations to scribes who record and compile the revelations into the Quran. It's the same story in here and in here, sort of. Different focus, different emphasis, and the characters are relocated in different places, but basically the same story. Now, most of us here tonight are Americans, and we've been raised in what has been called the Judaic-Christian culture. So the Quranic version of this story is the one with which we are probably the least familiar. So it may sound almost exotic to us, but it is sacred to Muslims. The Genesis story that we find in here, not sacred to Muslims. To Jews and Christians, yes. To Muslims, no. So let's take a look at Genesis. What do we think we know about this text? Well, we think we know that some of the earliest strands of the Bible are in Genesis. And it's written, we think we know that much of Genesis is written by an author whom we call J. And here's what we think we know about J. Well-educated, highly sophisticated and may have lived in the palace of Solomon or his son Rehoboam. Not lots of scholarly consensus on the date of the composition, but some say that the writer J is writing as a member of the elite during a relatively good period in early Israelite history. Something of a renaissance of Hebraic culture is taking place at the palace, and the palace elite, like the scribes and the translators, are very interested in their past, and they want to hear about what happened way back then. Now, just a quick aside, I can't help myself. Two brilliant, some would say misguided men, present an argument in this book, the Book of J, that some scholars call, that many scholars call a modern fantasy, but Bloom and Rosenberg make the claim that J was a woman. Imagine that, a woman writing Genesis, a smart, savvy woman in Solomon's court, and not in his harem, and not in the kitchen. She's in the library in the office. Now, there's practically no evidence to support this theory, and it's almost certainly unprovable, but it's a great read. A woman writing Genesis. You just can't miss that. You could borrow it. Actually, the stories in Genesis were most probably crafted from various sources and traditions over a long period of time. We have no extra biblical sources for any of the major characters in our story, so we don't know if Abraham actually existed. But we do have evidence of customs and laws and social practices that deal with issues like marriage and inheritance, surrogate motherhood, which support the internal chronology of the Hebrew Bible, which suggests a time period for Abraham and his family, sometime around the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Bronze Age. Now, the passage in the Bible that begins the Abraham saga is in chapter 12 of Genesis, and it's a brief passage, but it's filled with passion and drama and promise. But still, it really is a rather simple narration of certain events. God calls, Abraham journeys, and then God promises and blesses Abraham. And that's it in a nutshell. It's brief and seemingly uncomplicated, yet it is so different and so new from anything that's come before it, and so far-reaching that people today are still dealing with the theological and the socio-political implications of this story. So let's take a look at the story, and we'll start at the beginning. Right from the beginning, God is experiencing serious problems with his creation. It's time for a new plan. The garden plan didn't work out. Adam and Eve are evicted out of Eden. And a bit later it becomes clear it's time for a new man at the helm. Noah and the Ark adventure didn't work out. So God decides once again it's time for a new beginning. It's time to reconcile and restore his creation. And God decides to do that through Abraham and his family. So here's the story. 6 main characters. 2 men, Abraham and God. 2 women, Sarah and Hagar. And 2 kids, boys, Ishmael and Isaac. Now there are some minor characters scattered throughout the story, and some are more interesting than others, like Eliezer from Damascus. Nice guy. He's Abraham's manager. Very loyal. And there's the totally dysfunctional family of Abraham's nephew, Lot. There are 10 of them, and all of them are trouble. And there are assorted angels and kings and wicked sodomites. But we won't have time tonight to meet them all, because we have to get back to our story, which, as you know, begins with the call. God calls Abraham, and God tells Abraham, go. Go now. Leave your country, leave your family, leave your father's house. Go. Now notice, God doesn't tell Abraham where to go. That will come later. Now God only says, go and do what I tell you. And if you do, I will make you a great nation, and I will make your name great. That means everyone will know who you are. And almost everyone will bless you. And anyone who curses you, I'll curse them worse. And in you, Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And that deserves to be heard again. So I repeat, all the families of the earth will be blessed through you, Abraham. That's the promise. And arguably, that's the unifying theme of the Torah and the Bible and the Quran. And oh dear God, if only it were unifying. Right? So Abraham goes. He's 75 years old, and he brings his wife Sarah. She's old too, and barren, no children. And Abraham brings his nephew Lot, and Lot's wife and children, the whole crazy family. And they all bring everything they own, which is a lot. Sheep and goats and donkeys and slaves. And Abraham brings herders and shepherds and servants. So it's a big group, and they're on the move. And then they run into a big problem, famine. And famine in the ancient world almost always means slow, certain death. So to escape the famine, they all go to Egypt. But it's so strange. Abraham has just been with God, right? God has spoken with Abraham. And yet when Abraham runs into famine, he never once asks God for food assistance. Not once. Abraham just decides on his own to go out of his way to Egypt to escape the famine. Egypt is very big in these books, you'll see. Well, in Egypt, Abraham is sure he will find food to get them through the famine. But there is another big problem in Egypt. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh likes the ladies. He has a huge harem filled with particularly pretty ladies. And it just so happens that Sarah is one particularly pretty lady. No, I'm serious about this. Descriptions of Sarah's beauty have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I'm going to make some of us feel very good right now, because Sarah is in her 70s, and she is still looking so good. So good that Abraham knows that Pharaoh will take his wife, Sarah, into his harem right after he kills her husband, because that's how Pharaoh does it. So Abraham tells Sarah to lie to Pharaoh. Tell him I'm your brother, and whatever you do, don't say I'm your husband. So Sarah lies, and she's in the harem now. And just so you know, Pharaoh rewards brother Abraham with a plush suite at the palace and a very handsome reward for his beautiful sister. Abraham gets gold and silver and livestock. Now, what do we call a man who gives a woman to another man for sex and receives payment for her service? Pimp. Or maybe a moral coward. Yes, maybe a wimp. But how about a pimp? Oh, Abraham, how could you, right? Well, thank God. God steps in and saves Sarah, gets her out of that harem, and God gets them all on the road again. And by the way, Abraham gets to keep all that loot. All the booty that he got for the booty call, he gets to keep that. And they leave Egypt with their loot. And even Lot got loot. Lots of livestock and gold and silver. And they all go back to where they were before the famine. But they have so much more stuff now. that there's not enough room for Abraham's animals and Lot's livestock, and their herders and shepherds are fighting. So they decide to split up. And Abraham, who is a very amiable man, lets Lot choose the land that he wants. So Lot looks around and he chooses the very green plain. A very nice choice. The Jordan River is right there, and it's close to two terrific towns, Sodom and Gomorrah. What more could you ask for, right? And Abraham, he stays in Canaan, dry, dusty, rocky Canaan. But it's not too bad, because God visits Abraham there and makes him another promise of land and a promise of a big family. But so far, these are just promises. Sarah is still barren. Now there are lots of side stories about kings fighting and hostages being taken, but there's no time for these tonight. But I encourage you to read them. Very exciting. But back to our story. God visits Abraham again and promises a big family for him for the fourth time. But this time, Abraham talks back to God. Pretty gutsy, right? He tells God, I am still childless, God. I'm going to have to leave everything I own to my manager, good old Eliezer, because I am still childless. I have no heirs, no children. And then God stops Abraham, and we're building to something very important here, a really important part of the story. God takes Abraham by the arm, and he leads him out of the tent, and he tells Abraham, look at that sky. And they're in the desert, so no ambient light, right? It's a starry, starry sky night. And God tells Abraham, go ahead, Abraham, count the stars that you see. And of course, Abraham can't count them, because as Carl Sagan used to say, there are billions and billions of them. And God says, that's how many heirs you will have. I promise you, for the 5th time. And that's nice, but it's not earth-shattering. But here's the really important part of the story. It's not the promise. No, the really important part for Jews and Christians and Muslims is this. Ready? Abraham believes God. Torah says Abraham put his trust in God, and the next part is really huge. Because Abraham believes, God reckons his belief as righteousness. God reckoned it to Abraham's merit. And this is so important. Abraham gets credit for believing God. And now Abraham is about to get more, because now Abraham and God cut a covenant. They literally cut a deal, and it's a strange ceremony. Abraham cuts assorted dead animals and birds in half, and then he lines them up in 2 rows with a path between them. And then he sets the dead bodies on fire, and then he falls into a deep sleep, because it'd be way too terrifying to witness the theophany. Because God turns himself into fire and smoke and passes between the burning carcasses. God makes an everlasting covenant with Abraham this night. Very strange imagery, right? It's conception imagery, creation imagery, the creation of the people of Israel, unless you're a Christian. Then it's the imagery of the incarnation promise that is fulfilled in Christ Jesus, unless you're a Muslim. Then it's the imagery of the creation of the first Muslim, Ibrahim. Very dramatic. It's a seminal moment in history, pun intended, because this is about impregnated and conceiving, which makes the next 10 years of the story rather anticlimactic, because there is no impregnating, and Sarah is no longer willing to wait. She's upset with God. He closed her womb. And she's upset with Abraham. He hasn't produced a pregnancy. Abraham can't. God won't. So Sarah decides to take control of creation. And you know, This can't be good, right? So Sarah has an Egyptian slave, Hagar, who may have been part of the loot that Abraham got from Pharaoh. And Sarah takes Hagar and gives her to Abraham as a breeder wife. It's a historical solution. It's Sumerian. Any child from this union will belong to Sarah and Abraham, not to the slave Hagar. Well, Abraham doesn't object to Sarah's plan. Of course not. Hagar is much younger than Sarah, and she's also very attractive. And Abraham impregnates her on the first try, conception. So you would think there is at last shalom in the home, but no chance. Hagar gets all uppity and she lords her pregnancy over poor, old, barren Sarah. So now Sarah wants Abraham to punish Hagar for her bad attitude. And we're not told what Sarah wants Abraham to do. Beat her, probably. But Abraham is a good man. He doesn't want to be pregnant Hagar. So he tells Sarah, you beat her. And Sarah does, every day. And Hagar runs away into the desert, and she hides. But an angel finds her and tells her, go back and submit to Sarah. And Hagar obeys the angel. Hagar always obeys. And on the way back, Hagar meets God. And she names him El Roy, the God who sees me. And God makes promises to Hagar there in the desert. He promises her a son who will become a great nation. God is a promise maker. And Hagar goes back and she gives birth to a son. And Abraham names the baby Ishmael. God is a promise keeper. And 13 years go by, and God visits Abraham again, and God repeats the same promise that he has been making to Abraham for 23 years. But maybe this time the promise is a bit more specific, because this time there is the promise of land. God says, I am giving you this land forever. The covenant that I am making with you is everlasting. And then God repeats to Abraham, a son. You are going to have a son, and you are going to name him Isaac. He will rise to kings, to a great nation. He will be a great son. Now, Abraham is 99 years old, and Sarah is 90, so he's skeptical. Maybe he thinks God is a bit confused. So Abraham says to God, a son, huh? Oh, you must be talking about the son that I already have, Ishmael. But God interrupts Abraham. God knows what son he's talking about. He's God, right? And he tells Abraham, not Ishmael, you will have another son with Sarah, and you will name him Isaac, and this son will inherit everything. And don't worry about Ishmael. I'll take care of him. But Isaac, I promise you, this son is different. Isaac and his descendants will inherit everything forever. God is a promise maker. And now there is another covenant ceremony to seal the second son deal. But this time, God doesn't want Abraham to cut animals or birds. This time, God wants Abraham to cut penises. The penis of every man in his household. And then God wants Abraham to cut his own penis. It's circumcision, the everlasting sign of the covenant. No matter if the male is slave or free, even babies must be circumcised when they are 8 days old. And this is very serious and very important. If the penis is not cut, the man is cut out of the covenant. And Abraham obeys, as always. He does exactly what God commands, as always. So picture this. Abraham is sitting in the shade of his tent, exhausted and sore. It's a very painful operation, I'm told. Difficult recovery. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, out of the desert, 3 men show up, 3 visitors. They're strangers to Abraham, and they're standing right outside his tent. Now we're told that one of the men is God, and the other two are angels. But maybe all three of them are God. God in three persons? Very possible, right? Well, these three are promise makers. And right there in the shade of his tent, poor, sore Abraham hears the same promise of a son with Sarah for the 6th time. Well, when Sarah hears the promise, Sarah laughs. Now, there have been so many scholarly studies and commentaries that have been written about just these 2 words, Sarah laughs. But alas, we have no time for that tonight, because now our text goes right into a description of God and Abraham arguing. And not about the promised son. No, they're arguing about the fate of a wicked city. Abraham is actually haggling with God about how many men should die and how many should live. Abraham haggling with God in the Bible. Now, to be clear, most Muslims do not accept the notion that God and Abraham argue and haggle. Abraham is the model Muslim. He never questions. He submits. And the idea of God arguing with any man is absurd. Never going to happen. Allah does not negotiate. He does not cut covenants or make deals. But in this source, the Bible, Abraham and his descendants are very active participants in the covenant. And their part of the deal is to do chesed, loving acts of kindness. Abraham must do loving acts of kindness. But the really important part of the deal for us is the eternal stipulation in the covenant. Abraham must direct his household and teach the children of his household to do chesed, good deeds. And in return, God promises to continue to provide children. God promises to replenish the households of Abraham with billions and billions of descendants. Like that sky filled with stars, the world will be filled with good people doing good things. And this is a nice image, and it's God's plan. An unending supply of people who have promised to do what is right and just and kind and loving. So no wonder God tells his people, be fruitful, multiply, fill the world with good people doing good things. Now, to be clear, Muslims are in the same place. Charity and good deeds are at the core of the Quran, but how they get to the same place is different. Well, in our story, time marches on, but Sarah and Abraham stay in Canaan. But then Sarah conceives, and she gives birth to a son, Isaac. Abraham circumcises Isaac, and for years there really is shalom in the home. Hagar is a member of the household, and Isaac and Ishmael are together. They're raised as brothers. That's shalom. Until one day, out of the blue, Sarah fears for her son. Now, we don't know what happened. We just know that she tells Abraham, cast out the slave and her son. He will not inherit with my son. And those are the last words that Sarah speaks in the Bible. And it's strange. So do you think she's a protective mother or a money-grubbing monster? We don't know because the text doesn't explain. But Abraham, he's as confused as we are. He doesn't want to send Hagar and Ishmael out of the camp to certain death in the desert. But he doesn't want to defy Sarah either, apparently. So Abraham goes to God. He is sure God will have the solution. But God sides with Sarah. Cast them out. Now, Abraham manages to slip Sarah a skin of water and a hunk of bread before he banishes Hagar and Ishmael to the desert, exiled, abandoned, and alone. Now, Ishmael is around 15 years old, but Hagar carries him until the water runs out. Then she puts him under a bush. There's a little shade. And then she frantically runs between these two hills in the desert to look for water, to look for help. But there is no water, no help, no hope. So she sits down a distance away from Ishmael and she's crying, "I can't look on as my child dies." And those are the last words that Hagar speaks in the Bible. It's funny, both Hagar and Hagar and Sarah speak their last words in the Bible about their sons. Well, God hears Hagar, and God makes a spring of water right there in the desert. And they hydrate, and they stay in the desert, and they don't just survive, they thrive. Hagar finds Ishmael Egyptian wives, and he has 12 sons, and all of them are princes. Promises made and promises kept with Hagar and Ishmael. And back in the camp, all goes well with Sarah and Abraham and Isaac, until one day, out of the blue, Abraham thinks he hears God say, "Take the son you love to this mountain, tie him up, slit his throat, and then set him on fire." And we don't hear Abraham argue with God about this. There's no haggling here. Abraham gets ready to do as he is told. And you probably know that God saves Abraham and Isaac. But Sarah dies right after this. We don't know what Sarah knew, but she is dead. And Abraham and Isaac are heartbroken. Abraham buys a cave as a burial place for Sarah and the whole family. And Abraham and Isaac bury Sarah in the cave in Hebron, a very dangerous neighborhood. And he way overpaid for that cave. And then, you know how it goes. Life goes on. And Abraham gets good old Eliezer to get Isaac a wife in the old country. No Canaanite wife for Isaac, who's about 40 years old by now. And then, surprise, Abraham remarries to Keturah. I love Keturah. You will love her. Lots of great stories about this couple. They have 6 children together, all sons. And Abraham sees Isaac marry Rebekah, and then Abraham dies, a happy man, at 175 years old. And then both Ishmael and Isaac bury him in the cave with Sarah. And then the 2 brothers mourn their father together. What a nice image, a happy ending. And this is the story in the Bible. Nothing removed, nothing added to the text. It is sacred and authoritative for Jews and Christians. Now, this book has a second part. It's called the New Testament by many. And there are 27 books in the New Testament, mostly written in Greek in the 1st century CE. And Abraham is mentioned 75 times in the New Testament. In fact, the gospel writer Matthew traces the genealogy of Jesus straight back to Abraham. Jesus is called the son of Abraham in Matthew's gospel and in Luke's gospel. Now, beside the Gospels, there are 14 letters in the New Testament, epistles, credited to Paul, and they're named for the people that he sent them to, Romans and Corinthians, Galatians. Now, in these letters, Paul refers to Abraham 19 times, more than any other individual except Jesus. And the New Testament is all about Jesus. So what about Abraham and his story is so compelling to Paul? Well, sadly, faith promotes disunity and disparity within the families of Abraham, and not just between the old divide, the families of Ishmael and Isaac. Now, in Paul especially, we see new divisions open up between Abraham's descendants from Isaac. In Paul's world, there are Jews by birth and faith who believe they are the only true descendants of Abraham. So they believe they are the only true inheritors of the promise. But at the same time, there are living in the same place Jews by birth and faith who embrace the revelation of Jesus as the Messiah. And these Jews believe they too are the rightful heirs of the promises God made to Abraham. And then there are those unrelated to Judaism by faith or by birth. They are the Gentiles, and they believe through adoption they are true descendants and inheritors. And this is the group that Paul is preaching to and writing to. Paul is an evangelist, preaching and writing to mixed crowds, Jews and Gentiles. Paul's mission is to expand first century Judaism to include Gentiles. And to do this, he needs a bigger tent. And the story of Abraham is perfect for that. You see, says Paul, Abraham believed. He had faith that God would keep his promises. And Abraham had this faith BC, before circumcision. And that's true. So Paul tells the Gentiles, you don't have to be circumcised to be part of the covenant, part of the family. You only need to believe like Abraham. You need to have faith. And Paul continues, Abraham was reckoned righteous by God before the law was given to Moses at Sinai, 500 years before. And that's true. So Paul says, you don't need the law. All those laws, they're not bad, they're mostly good, but you don't need them to be righteous. You just need to believe. You need to have the faith of Abraham. And then Paul expands even further. Paul tells his listeners, God extends his promises and blessings to Abraham and his offspring. God extends promises to the seed of Abraham, offspring, seed. These are singular words, not plural. And who is the true seed of Abraham? Jesus Christ. So those who have faith in Christ are members of Abraham's family by adoption. Faith replaces biology, and belief replaces blood. Believe and you belong. Now this worked for Paul then, and it works for many Christians now. It does not work for Jews and does not work for Muslims. Remember, the Genesis story is not accepted as sacred and authoritative by Muslims. For Muslims, the sacred texts are the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran, written in the 7th century in Arabic. Actually, the Quran was not written. Rather, it was recited by Allah to the Prophet Muhammad, who recited it to the scribes who wrote down the revelations. Now, the Quran is the supreme authority. It is the word of God, which was revealed to Muhammad through the angel Jabril, also known as the angel Gabriel, the angel of revelation. And the revelations begin in the year 610 CE, on the night of power. And they continue for around 25 years, gradual revelations. And only Allah speaks in the Quran. Muhammad never speaks. And the Quran is a very difficult text for non-Arabic speakers, maybe even baffling. And many Muslims believe that the Quran cannot be translated. Only in Arabic can it be grasped. Well, it is translated in almost every language on the planet. Now, it was explained to me by a Muslim friend in div school that he thinks about the Quran the way I think about Jesus, the incarnation of God. So the Quran is not just a book, it is God himself. And the Quran is unique to Islam, and Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac are all over the Quran. Now, Sarah appears once in the Quran, and she's not named. And surprise, Hagar appears not at all, although some say there is an allusion to Hagar in a prayer spoken by Abraham in the Quran. So just like the New Testament, the second text, the Quran pays more attention to Abraham than it does to his wives. And the Quran draws on stories from the Bible about Abraham and his family. And there are other traditional stories that are not in the Quran, but that tell the story. There are 114 surahs in the Quran, chapters. And these are divided into ayats, verses, and they vary in length, from 3 ayats to 286 verses. And the chapters are arranged in order of length. Chapters are not arranged chronologically, and they're not arranged thematically, and this can make it very difficult to read. But be sure, Abraham and his family, all over the Quran. Actually, it has been said that everything in Islam is bound to Abraham. So how does Abraham become pivotal to Islam? Well, first of all, Muhammad knew the Hebrew scriptures, and he knew the Gospels. And you should know that in the Quran, there is also a call, but different from the call that Abraham got from God in the Bible. The call that Abraham gets in the Quran is a call to come. The Quran calls believers to come back to the religion of Abraham that has been corrupted by the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians. Now, in the Quran, Abraham is not the father of the chosen people, the Jews, and he's not the father of the people who claim their righteousness by their faith through Jesus Christ, the Christians. For Muslims, Abraham is the key figure in a series of prophets which culminates in Muhammad, the seal of the prophets. Now, we won't read or exegete the Quran tonight. Instead, we will vicariously experience the reenactment of the Quranic version of the Abraham story, which is told to teach Muslims how to be good Muslims. Good Muslims practice complete submission to Allah, the one and only God. Allah speaks and you do. You do not question Allah. You trust Allah completely. And who is the paradigm of piety? Who is always obedient to Allah? Who has almost unimaginable faith in Allah? Well, that would be Abraham. And nobody loves Abraham like Muslims. Every year, millions of Muslims from every corner of the globe gather in one place to celebrate their love of Abraham and his legacy. The struggles of Abraham and his family are reenacted at this love convention every year. And what is that convention called? The Hajj, right. Now, before his death, Muhammad declared the Hajj as the fifth pillar of Islam. But the Hajj is much older than that. The Hajj is traced back to the time of Abraham. And literally millions of Muslims return to that time as they make their Hajj, their journey, their pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, so that they can stand on the very spot where Abraham stood as he repaired the Kaaba, the most sacred place in the world. God commanded Abraham and Ishmael to rebuild and to purify the holy house, the Kaaba, in the city of Mecca. And God commanded Abraham to initiate this obligatory pilgrimage, the Hajj. And that's in Surah 41, Ayat 120. I could read that one. Now, if you could make the Hajj, and most of us here tonight could not make a Hajj, it's only permitted for Muslims. But if you could stand on the very spot that God left his footprints on earth, sacred ground. And you could look up from that spot and you would see the grand mosque built on this holy ground. And nearby there's a large rock, which is called the Maqam Ibrahim, where Abraham left his footprints. Now, the pilgrims who make the Hajj are called Hajis, and every year millions of Hajis reenact Hagar's and Ishmael's experiences in the desert. Now, in the Quranic version of the story that we read in Genesis, Hagar and Ishmael are brought to the desert by Abraham, but they're left in the desert by Allah to test their faith. And there are reenactments of this test. The Hajis quickly walk between those two hillocks, but here they're called Safa and Marwa, just like Hagar did in her search for help to save her son Ishmael. Well, today the Hajis have a more comfortable experience than Hagar and Ishmael had, because the whole area is now paved with marble and enclosed in a large air-conditioned space with 3 wide pathways for going, for coming, and for wheelchairs. And Hajis are able to drink from the miraculous Zamzam well, which Allah provided in response to Hagar's pleas for help for Ishmael. And there are other important reenactments, like symbolically stoning the devil. And there is a slaughtering of animals, which commemorates Abraham's readiness to slaughter his son, Ishmael, at Allah's command. Well, as you can imagine, it's quite the experience to make the Hajj, a once-in-a-lifetime experience for most Hajis, an experience that has religious, social, and political purposes. But the main purpose of the Hajj is to create love of Allah, to teach that even if you are stranded in the desert, out of water, like Hagar and Ishmael were, Allah will never abandon you. Allah will always show mercy. And the Hajj will teach you that just like Abraham and Hagar, you must totally and completely submit your will to Allah. Now, it's not an easy trip, and it's expensive, and it can be dangerous. Huge crowds create huge problems, and no joke, thousands of Hajis die every year from accidents, stampedes, heat strokes, and communicable diseases, and still millions go every year. But non-Muslims can't go, and not just to the Hajj. Non-Muslims can't go to Mecca. It's a closed city, and non-Muslims are subject to fines and deported if they're apprehended in Mecca. So the Hajj in the holy city of Mecca is not an inter-religious opportunity. It's exclusive. But many say Islam is not exclusive. Islam truly is universal in its ideals, and Abraham is an embodiment of that universalism that is implicit in Islam. So now you've heard the stories, the Abrahamic discourse, 3 versions of the same story, or sort of the same story. So what do you think? Can we find peace in the Abrahamic discourse? Can there be a reconciliation among Abraham's descendants? Can we find it in Ishmael and Isaac, 2 brothers? Lots of reasons for them to be estranged, but when their father dies, they set aside their differences and they mourn together. And it's nice to think that they stayed in touch after the funeral, that their families got to know each other, that they had family reunions. It's nice to hope that at Abraham's funeral, his sons found reconciliation, and we can see them standing side by side outside of that overpriced cave in Hebron, wondering, what do you want from us, Father? What do you want us to do now? And the way that we answer that question today, here, tonight, could change the history of the world, the way Abraham changed the world when he heard the calls, come and go. That's what we should do. Listen for the call, come together. And then you should go in search of the answer. But you should go believing that the answer could be seated at the table right next to you. So let us hope that you are the answer, that we are the answer to reconciliation. And thank you all for your attention. Todah, Shukra, and God bless you.